Just want to throw out a quick disclaimer that this is a sequel story time to a previous narrative-driven video that I've posted on my channel called Saltwater Dreams. So if you haven't seen that, what's going on in this one won't make any sense. So make sure you watch that one or listen to that one before you listen to this one. I was not intending to write a sequel when I wrote the first part, so I really have no idea how this story is going to end. So I hope you enjoy coming along with the ride, and I guess we'll see where we end up. Now that that's all out in the open, I invite you to listen to Saltwater Dreams, Chapter 2, In the Family. I closed my car door and leaned against the car a while, staring at my old house. It was just as I remembered it. The tree in the yard, the pale blue walls and gray shingles, the windows with curtains drawn and white trims stained by weather and yellowed by time. Any other day, I might have felt welcomed here, like I belonged. Now, I was faced with something I'd never experienced before. A feeling of foreboding that had manifested itself in the 12-hour drive from the hospital to here. My eyes were burning with exhaustion and weepy from staring by the time I finally shook myself out of my daze, locking the car and deciding to leave what little I had with me behind. Really, it was only as much as my roommate could bring in the time it took me to dodge questions from doctors who clearly wanted more answers than I was willing to give. She'd brought a few essentials: my toothbrush in a plastic bag, my hairbrush, a nightgown, and a few changes of clothes. Just a couple days' worth of things I could use to get by. She'd brought my sleeping pills, too. I'd left those behind in the glove box. Out of sight, but never out of mind. I trotted up the neatly paved path to my front door and paused one last time to gather my wits before knocking. It took no time at all for the door to open to my mother, wearing a near white nightgown with a cheerful smile that quickly faded when she got a proper look at me. She said nothing for a moment and scanned me over, zeroing in on my injured arm and delicately pulling it up. "What on earth?" she muttered. "What happened?" She didn't wait for an answer before pushing in and hugging me tight. I took a shallow breath, squeezed her tight in place of an answer, and she pulled back and invited me in, wandering over to the kitchen and calling out to my father, who also zeroed in on my injuries before a brief, tight hug and more questions I wasn't prepared to answer. "Can I just use the bathroom?" I said, abruptly and without any satisfactory answers. My parents exchanged worried looks, but nodded, let me slip into the hall and into the bathroom, closing the door behind me and resting my forehead against it. It was cool against my skin, and I used it to brace myself long enough to summon the guts to look in the mirror. My roommate had been right on the money when she said I looked like hell frozen over. My skin was dewy in all the wrong ways, and still paler than I'd like. My eyes were bloodshot and ached from lack of sleep, from stress, from the long drive and the late hour. There were bags already forming under my eyes, lightly tinged purple and seeming to carry months more stress than I'd experienced. It was all catching up to me, and it showed. The only thing left neat now was the line of stitches on my arm I'd covered with a patch of bandage to keep it from catching. Maybe it was a paranoid instinct, but I don't think I could be blamed at this point. I pulled my hair back into a crude ponytail and pulled the elastic off my wrist to secure it before resting my hands on the counter and making eye contact with myself and muttering something reassuring. I'd had a psychology professor once tell me that positive affirmations into a mirror had a measurable effect. I didn't feel it. I shook off my nerves and flushed the toilet to keep up appearances, washing my hands to buy time before slipping out and dabbing the leftover moisture on my jeans and wandering over to the dining room table, where my parents had set up our own private intervention, even if they didn't know what it was they were going to save me from. "What happened to your arm?" my father said, starting off strong with a gentle, worried interrogation. "I fell," I said quietly. I slipped and crashed into a stair. It was dark. He softened and squeezed my hand. You have to be more careful. Yeah. I smiled faintly and met his gaze. He had no clue what he was asking me, but there was no denying he wanted to. But right now, he wasn't the person who was going to know what was happening to me. As much as I wanted to tell them both everything, I needed to wait until I had something concrete to say. It's late, Dad. You should get some rest. Let us ladies catch up for a little while. He hesitated, catching my meaning and looking between us both as though he desperately wanted to put his foot down. He smiled instead and stood. He kissed my forehead and squeezed my mom's arm. I'll see you both in the morning. We'll have pancakes for the occasion. I nodded. Sounds great, Dad. My father lingered in uncomfortable silence before slipping away. I waited until his footsteps had faded, and all I could hear was the creaking in his bedroom. When he was finally out of earshot, I let out a breath I felt I'd been holding on to for too long. What's really going on, Sarah? My mother said, quietly and while staring at her hands, laced together on the table. Her eyes were almost impossible to read. I imagined mine were, too. Dr. Fitzpatrick was out of town this week. It was as good a place as any to start, and once I'd started, it all wound out of control. I showed the barely visible scrapes on my wrist, pulled the bandages away, showed the scratches and scrapes on my legs where I could. I told her everything, and she sat in silence and stared at the tabletop without so much as a flinch as I recounted, in painful detail, my time in the lighthouse and the figure following me. I couldn't bring myself to recount the details of his face. When my story was done, neither of us knew what to say, so we said nothing. We sat there and found places to lock our eyes and let darkness take over. Shadows played tricks on my vision, and I had to blink continuously to keep myself from drifting in and out of sleep. Whatever dreams may come, I wanted nothing to do with them. Not now, and not ever. But eventually, against my will, I would have to sleep. I would have to close my eyes, and I'd have to face this, whatever it was. Did I ever tell you? My mother whispered. It startled me, and I looked at her again as if I was looking at a ghost. She paused for a long time. Did I ever tell you about the place my father sent me? As a girl. I shook my head, and she nodded slowly. There's so much that you don't know. So much I hoped I'd never have to tell you. She glanced up at me. When I was young, I always imagined I'd spend the rest of my life alone. I'd never have a husband or a child. I'd never have to worry about telling you about the shadows on the walls. When your nightmare started, I wanted to believe so desperately that they were just nightmares. Nothing's ever that simple. Mom, what are you talking about? She sighed. Maybe it's better to show you. Without another word, she stood, and I wasted no time following her into the basement door and down into the darkness. She pulled on the drawstring light and took a slow, even breath before meandering over to a stack of boxes I'd always been too afraid to touch as a child. She carefully slid one out of its place and set it down, unclasping the lid and wiping away the layer of fine dust that had accumulated over the years, and looking at me. These are your answers. At least, these are the answers I can give you. You've seen the frowning man, haven't you? I almost didn't recognize the sound of my own voice. It was all at once shaky and certain, hollow and filled to the brim with fear. I had never known myself to be fragile, but in this moment, I felt like that was all that I was. "Yes," she whispered. "And I don't think I'm the only one." "What does that mean?" I prodded, pushing forward and coming to my knees to grab her arms. "What does any of this mean?" "Read," she said. "Read these, and everything I know, you'll know too." She glanced down into the box, and I followed her eyes to the front cover of a red, leather-bound journal. It had ornate black details around the border. For all the dust and decay of an unfinished basement, I had never seen a book look so pristine. "But tonight," she whispered, "you should sleep." I snapped my eyes to hers. "I can't. You have to." She took my face in her hands. "If you stay awake for too long, he'll find you here, too." There was a soft urgency in those tired eyes, and I just watched her face shift as the ever-swaying basement light shifted the shadows on her face. They made her every fine wrinkle seem a chasm, and I swear her eyes had never looked so sunken in my life. "Okay," I whispered. She said nothing as she lifted my hands gently and pulled me to my feet. No one made a sound as she led me up to the kitchen, then up to my childhood bedroom. It was exactly how I left it when I moved out for college, but everything felt different now. Everything was darker than before. My mother brought me to the bed and set me down. "I'll stay with you tonight. When the noise gets to be too much, I'll wake you. Promise?" "I promise." Even still, as she curled up to my side and my head hit the pillow, I found myself resisting every blink, every way my eyes sought out the shadows. I focused on the moonlight even as my mother's breaths slowed and deepened, and even as the night turned into the next day. It was only when the sun began to rise that I noticed something different. The rising sun cast vast, lingering shadows over the room like thick tree trunks in the lace pattern of branches and leaves. I stared at it in silence for a moment, before slowly turning my head and staring in bewilderment at the tall, hulking tree cast in an eerie gray glow. Its trunk was long and lanky, with the canopy seemingly miles above my head and sparsely populated by branches and leaves that were orange and brown and ready to fall. What I might have called sunlight was gray and dingy, and the air was cold and almost stagnant. I took a step forward and glanced back to where my mother should have been, but there was no bed, no wall, no bedroom, just layer after layer of trees stretching out as far as the eye could see, with no beginning or end in sight. I shivered and grabbed my coat, pulling it tighter around my shoulders and wandering forward blindly. Leaves drifted down slowly, on a breeze that sent shivers to the very core of my being. It was as if there was a hole in my chest, and my insides were absorbing the chill as it phased through me. For all the crisp crunch of the leaves under my feet, there was a deafening silence. I didn't hear the leaves crackle and break apart under my weight, or even the smushing squelch of unsatisfying wet leaves no longer able to come undone under your weight. The wind I could feel running its way through me was silent, too, and the leaves that tumbled down, few and far between, made no noise. The slowly shifting branches made no sound. All I could hear was the uneven, choppy rhythm of my own breathing and the shifting of my clothes rubbing against one another. I wandered forward with no real goal in mind. The tree branches were far too high to be reached or used as leverage to pull myself off the ground, and with no sound to make my way to, no bubbling stream or bustle of a distant city, I was aimless. Like always, I just knew that I had to keep moving. I didn't know why or what I was running from exactly, but I knew that I needed to keep going. My hair swished back and forth behind me in a ponytail, and I paused when it brushed my back, reaching up and pulling it down slowly. I remembered now, vaguely, putting it up in my parents' house, in their bathroom. I wasn't alone. "Mom?" I called. It pierced the air like a knife, but didn't echo. It started and stopped as cleanly as I'd ever heard it, and I shuddered. There was something deeply wrong with this place, and the longer I stood here, still and unmoving, the more I felt I was about to be swallowed whole by it. That may have been weak justification for running, but I convinced myself a light jog wouldn't be an overreaction at this point, and I focused on my breathing, perhaps because it was the only sound in this vacant wasteland to focus on. No matter how long I pushed, it seemed like the trees just multiplied again and again in a never-ending loop I couldn't find the end of. It just continued on and on for what seemed like forever, noiseless and desolate. At least, it was. Until, like a sudden scream in the dark, I heard the crunch of leaves crackling apart behind me. The sound was distant, but omnipresent. It was quiet in such a way that maybe, if there were other sounds to focus on, I might have missed it. But there was a presence to the sound unlike anything I'd felt before. It demanded to be heard, and it demanded my attention. Slowly, I turned on my heel, nauseous at the sudden rush of noise, of leaves shifting, breaking, and squelching under my feet as I moved, and the wind that now seemed to burrow into my ears. There, in the distance, was a figure unmistakable. His shadow loomed, hunched and contorted, facing me. I couldn't make out his face, but a shard of clarity reminded me I'd seen it before. Time and time again, we found ourselves here. In a forest, in the ocean, in a lighthouse, in my childhood nursery. He made no moves, one foot slightly in front of the other, and I watched him sway back and forth like a porch swing. We waited, breaths even and movement subtle and slow, for the other to start the game. And as the time ticked achingly by, I felt something rising in my chest like a sickness. It burned its way from my feet to my lungs to my chest and into my brain, and it had only one thing to say: run. In a flash, I whipped around and bolted as fast as I could in the opposite direction, dodging through every narrow, winding bit of tree I could fit through. Anything to trip him up, to slow him down. The one thing I knew about a creature this stunted: it could run, but it had to run slow. I already had a head start, but if I knew anything, it was that there was no head start that could keep me away from him forever. The wind picked up its pace suddenly and seemed to chase after me, buffeting up the hood on my jacket and all but forcing me to the ground. But I fought to keep my footing and leaned against the hulking trunks of the now swaying trees as I soldiered on. The howling of the wind sounded like that of a wild animal waiting to devour its prey, and the trees groaned as if ready to collapse. Branches snapped off and flew about, slamming into my back and hitting the ground just before my feet came down and broke them in half. The once slow-falling leaves were now blurs of dull color whipping around in front of me. The sound was so overwhelming that when the tree in front of me let out a treacherous cry, I almost didn't notice until it was falling, roots ripping out of the ground and displacing the ground at my feet. It fell away from me and crashed to the ground, but not before tossing me backwards and sending me crashing into the ground hard. I gasped and gagged, reaching out vainly as if to recapture my breath. My back screamed in pain and my vision strained, tinged red and black. I struggled, but every motion left me slamming back into the exposed root that had found its new resting place in the center of my spine. I groaned against the burning of my lungs and struggled to roll to the side, gagging and fighting every instinct in my body not to throw up. I scanned dazedly around the ground and bit my lip hard to fight the pain. I could see his boots, shambling ever closer in a clumsy but quick gait that was catching up fast. I shoved to my feet despite the screaming of my lungs and reached out for the tree that had forsaken me, leaning against it with one hand and using the other to brace my ribs as though it would hold me together as I shambled forward. I didn't have to be a sprinter. I just had to be faster than he was. "Mom!" I screamed again. If she couldn't hear me here, maybe, wherever she was, wherever I was, she'd hear me there. "Mom!" The low, guttural growl forced its way through the whipping howl of the wind, and I cried out. "Mom!" I cried, more desperately this time. "Wake me up!" My feet caught on a small branch and I stumbled, coughing violently and stopping despite my every instinct wailing at me to continue. The growling only grew louder until it drowned out even my pleas for help, and even the sound of my own heartbeat. "Mom! Sarah!" I gasped and cried out, curling into my legs and finally catching on a sob. My mother smoothed my hair and I let my every pain find its way out of my body. Why didn't you wake me?" "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." She coiled her arms around me and I heard my door slam open and my father's frantic breaths as he came to a stop in the doorway. My mother lifted up and must have looked at him, but I didn't. I basked in the raw, radiating pain in my back and tuned out the world. It took me a long time to stop crying, but when I did, my mother lifted my shirt and snapped a picture of the bruise on my back, directly over my spine, already a dark purple and larger than I imagined a bruise could be. My father's eyes brimmed with questions he didn't ask, and instead, he went downstairs and made good on the promise of pancakes. I took a shower that morning and tried my best to hold myself together for whatever answers may come, and however bad they may be.